Hello and welcome to the Occult Book Review. This week's book is The Witch's Ointment, The Secret History of Psychedelic Magic by Thomas Hatsis. This is probably one of the most, I know I say this quite a lot, but it's been a very good year for occult history, I think, and for revealing new knowledge, especially this book here. This book was 10 years in the writing. At one point, the author mentions that he got to a point where he had to be able to read Latin in order to go any further. So he took a break from writing the book, took 2.5 years to learn Latin, and then went back to writing it again. So it's probably the first book dealing with the witch's ointment, where someone has brought all these primary sources into a contemporary context. At least I don't know of a book before this which has had so much thorough and new sources. And the sources come from places you might expect and also places that you might not, such as medieval poets who turn out to be quite a rich source for, I suppose it's not that unusual, they're a very rich source of folkloric knowledge and local custom as much as anything else. So throughout the book, the journey is to really find what caused the witch stereotype that we know today, so with the associations of the broom and the flying ointment. Now, what we discover is that throughout the 14th century, 14th and 15th century in particular, is a time where a lot of folk ideas and customs became demonized, and leading up into the Inquisition, this all coagulates into one archetype, which becomes very useful for the church in order to heighten their own authority and to stamp out magic and customs that they could then call satanic. Hatsis uses a technique where he gives us the perspective of a lot of the characters that he's talking about. So we get these little anecdotes throughout the book, and we see what the character is going through, and we also, which is kind of, it's hard to read sometimes because, as you can imagine, he's talking about how these characters were tortured, the things that were done to them, and you can basically be made to say anything really when you are under that kind of physical and psychological torment. But he talks about folk medicine, how these people were basically shaman, and the idea of what that folk medicine was, the ideas, the connections between mortality rate, reputation, having to even pay a fee in the first place, and the idea of intent versus negligence, which becomes very important later on when the Inquisition takes hold. The idea that there was some worldwide fertility cult, I think, is kind of going out of fashion now. However, the idea that there was a worldwide natural shamanism which venerated kind of earth goddesses is shown to be the case in this book, especially when it comes to Diana and some German goddesses, which I'll talk about later. But the idea that all of these things were not Christian became the way for the Inquisitors to ultimately say that they were of the devil, and that is kind of one of the reasons that the witch's ointment came into kind of the consciousness of these people, and how they were able to kind of demonize them literally. One of the takeaways from this book is to really be careful about what you say, and be careful about statements that have previously been thrown out there without much thought behind them. Even the idea of the medicines being used for certain purposes. What Hatsis shows that for most of the time the same medicine could be used for different things. Often it was a case of set and setting which would change the outcome. So we get a breakdown of things like mandrake, henbane, opium, datura, deadly nightshade, belladonna, and we get examples of what these herbs and plants can do. But as I've said, what's really interesting is we get examples of them doing completely different things depending on the context. So sometimes they're used to put someone in a trance, or sent off, in some kind of shamanic travel or dream state. But other times they're used to rouse people. And this idea, he goes back to early Gnosticism, even to Simon Magus and his supposed love philters, to show that there was a wide knowledge of plants and herbs and their purposes out there. But we need to understand that people saw these plants and herbs as being they weren't just used for one thing. I don't belabor the point, but it's really important to understand that. And so the idea today is this plant will do this plant will do that, but really that's not the way they were used. An important group mentioned in the book is the Gnostic Sect, the Waldensians, and they really were demonized in terms of being the scapegoats in an awful lot of cases, and a lot of terrible anecdotes in the book about what happened to them. A lot of the stereotypical components of what witches were supposed to be and do were thrown upon them. The idea of them being cannibals, baking bread from the blood of infants, then kind of going into an orgy, and finally like the devil would appear and so on. But what Hatsis shows is that this all became really something that stemmed from, you were either going to stick with the church and back that up, or you weren't. And if you weren't, then it didn't matter what you done, because as he talks about, an awful lot of the people in these small villages and towns, they may have seen the medicine people as being eccentric or outsiders, and they may have they kind of accepted that they may have had dealings with local spirits, but they didn't see them as being devil worshippers or Satanists. This was something that came really, I suppose, I think it was 1430 was the date that the author gives as being the real moment where the witch's ointment and that archetype of the witch comes into being. But all of the plants and the medicines that were used, they were used like in some very holistic way. There were psychoactive and non-psychoactive plants in this big broad spectrum of magic and medicine. So this idea of you're either with us or you're against us was really how the church began to take over this whole realm and put down the people that were, again, as I would advocate, they were shaman, really. It was kind of one of the most effective ways of doing it was by telling people that if you know about these people and you don't tell, then you're going to be as guilty as them, which meant you're going to be burnt if we find out. And there were all kinds of ways for the authorities, who were getting stronger, the church was spreading out, there were all kinds of ways for them to get at people, and often it was the case of you were trying to save your own skin, and as I mentioned earlier, torture can get people to say anything. So this kind of takeover of knowledge is shown in various examples. It was a case then, if you went out to get a plant, there were stories that if you didn't bless the plant first, there might be a demon in it. So you can see all these kind of nefarious ways, and subtle and not so subtle ways, to take over folk medicine. So the result of all of this was that your status as a witch began to be defined by theology, and the local spirits and plants became the demons. And this all led up, of course, to the Malus Maleficarum, which was something that everyone, I suppose, involved in or kind of interested in the occult would know about. But Hatsis gives very interesting insights to it and its composition and the things that it left out. And it seems certain things were left out deliberately, certainly in the case of folk medicine. But one thing I kind of began to think about then when he was talking about that was the impact that all of this had upon inquisitors later on is something we all know about, and we say, right, they were wrong, they were superstitious, and they fell for this archetype. But around that time, you had an awful lot of grimoires being written, and certainly later as well. And these grimoire writers, who seem to have escaped that kind of scrutiny, certainly in the occult world, I think, they also drew from the wrong sources, the kind of distortions. They also drew from this kind of superstition and false archetype, and yet a lot of the grimoires are seen as being effective and real. It's something that kind of niggles at me, like, because like Hatsis is basically showing us here that the folk medicine archetype is a lot different to the witch and the demon befriending and knowing archetype. It's wrong. It's not actually real. It's a creation of the church, and yet from that came occult books that are considered real, and I don't think they really are. I think they're just as superstitious and just as wrong. Now, that's me just going off on a tangent there, sorry. So this transition from an ointment that may have been used and rubbed upon a person, and how that became an ointment that was rubbed on a broom and inserted inside the body sometimes, and used to magically transport someone to a land where supernatural beings would gather, and ultimately they would pay homage to the devil. All of this is taken by Hatsis, and it's explored using different techniques involving the plant lore, involving the theological perspective, and also the idea of the old pagan goddesses. And he talks about an image of Frigg and Diana. The one with Frigg, actually, he talks about, she's actually riding a broomstick, and yet it doesn't explain in itself how that motif became so popular. However, what does explain it is how he kind of opens up all of these inquisitors' texts and how things change. And what I mean by that is how one confession suddenly becomes much more elaborate and sensational, and toads are involved and broomsticks are involved, and ultimately when we go back to another Waldensian trial, he talks about a staff that's passed from one initiate to another in order to help them get to these magical places. And another argument in the book, and another really interesting topic, I suppose, is that very elusive area between what was considered magical in the mind sense and what was considered real, as in people travelling the night, going into houses, transforming into animals, cavorting with the devil, and how the theological perspective used that to its own advantage in order to accuse more and more people. The book then finishes in a very satisfying way. I won't talk about the ending of the book because I've said that during my last review. People don't want me to talk about the author's conclusions, so sometimes it makes it difficult and it makes me ramble a little bit because I do want to put a proper ending to the review, but I am aware that I shouldn't really talk about what the author finally says, so I won't. But he goes into an area of shamanism. He talks about Paracelsus, he talks about Agrippa, and he talks about Margaret Murray as well, which I thought was interesting. All of these things have, I think there's been we've been misconstruing a lot of these things for a very long time. And it's really, really good to see someone going back to primary sources and coming up with this very coherent and very sensible, I think, explanation for what became the witch's ointment, what became the archetype of the witch. And I found that as the book went on, the author has a very it's a very what would you say? It's a very entertaining style of writing, even though it's quite an academic book, and I think that's really good. I think it's great that we can get books like this at a price that we can afford, and inner traditions have to be praised for that as well, of course. But even with the author's entertaining style, you feel an oppression, because you know it's coming. You know it's coming for these people. You know it's coming for the folk medicine people. You know it's coming for the shaman. You know it's coming for women and men who kind of try to keep these old traditions alive. So in that sense, it adds kind of it's an excitement as well, of course, because you kind of think that, well, we're so caught up in what has happened. Is there hope? Is there something, some kind of redemption for the shamanistic view? And I think there is. So that's why I'm saying, like, I don't want to talk about what the author says, and which is why I'm kind of rambling, but I hope I'm conveying that it's well worth reading, and the ending is it's very, very satisfying. So the book is The Witch's Ointment, The Secret History of Psychedelic Magic by Thomas Hatsis, and it's published by Inner Traditions. So I'll see you again next week for another occult book review. Thanks.